Hello, welcome back, my lovelies. Today, I will be reading the currently second chapter of Izuku Midoriya's disastrous guide to living a double life by Leahistyping. I hope you'll enjoy this as well as have a nice day, take care of yourself, and let's get started. Chapter 2. Don't try this at home, kids! Seriously, don't try this at home. Karma had heard about him on the news and police databases. His current record was 17 kills and 23 irreversible injuries. To make it worse, his quirk was a complete mystery, so Karma had no idea what he was up against. He could barely go against pros, let alone Stain. If there was an opening, Karma would probably be able to make a run for it and avoid any sort of confrontation. I don't plan on killing you, Stain said, interrupting Karma's train of thought. I cleanse society of corrupt heroes, not children playing dress-up. Okay, I can't take wannabe hero, but I'm not playing dress-up. Karma scoffed, wholeheartedly offended. He had a lot of people to take him seriously over the year, but no one ever dismissed his efforts as child's play. Stain looked him up and down, curiously, before leaning back against the dumpster he was previously rummaging through. He must have found what he was looking for, as he said a moment later. You're serious about being a hero? His voice was free of mockery or teasing, and filled with just simple curiosity. Like I said, Karma said timidly, being a pro isn't really in the cards for me, at least right now, but I am serious about being a vigilante. It's my way of helping people, especially those that are forgotten or missed. Stain hummed, looking at Karma intently. The vigilante stiffened under the intense gaze of the hero killer. Well, you're brave, kid. Most people run after realizing who I am. Thank you, sir, Karma replied, resisting the urge to bow in gratitude. The formalities are unnecessary, Stain said, raising his right hand while the other still rested on his scabbard. I do have a question for you, if that's all right. Karma asked hesitantly. Maybe this was what he was waiting for? All he needed to do was stretch out his arm and take it. I can't promise an answer, but proceed, Stain replied, now leaning against the alley wall, his arms crossed over his chest. You've taken down dozens of pro heroes without a problem. How can I do that? How do I get as strong as you? Karma asked, borderline desperate. Eraser's advice helped, but he needed something more direct. Stain was silent for a moment, which only caused more tension to rise throughout the dirty alleyway. He tapped his boot lightly against the pavement, and his mouth pursed as he considered a response. A second later, he jumped to the top of the building. They were beside and sat on the edge of the roof. Take a seat, kid, he called, patting the ledge next to him. Karma used the fire escapes and other random objects along the brick wall to make his way up effortlessly. A few seconds later, he was situated on the ledge next to the hero killer. Eraser would murder him if he knew what he was up to right now. Impressive, Stain mused quietly before clearing his throat. Strength isn't just about raw power. Thinking that way will only get you killed. Stain began. Karma nodded at the words of advice, but became more curious about what it was leading to. Strength is your mental fortitude along with your ability to plan and strategize against your opponent. If you go in head first believing that brute force will be your way to victory, then you won't get far. You don't always need physical strength to beat an opponent. Stain explained, his gaze focusing on the various buildings that created Hosu. What do you mean? Karma asked, confusion spread across his features. He knew that strategizing was essential to fighting. The sports festival proved that much. But how was he supposed to face off against people with strong offensive quirks when all he had was his fists? Still don't get it, huh? Stain asked casually. Karma shook his head and turned towards the city. What was Stain trying to say? Hasn't physical strength always been a prerequisite when facing off against an opponent? All of a sudden, Karma felt a sharp pain in his arm, followed by the complete paralysis of his entire body. He fell forward, terrified that he was about to fall to his doom, with no way to save himself, until strong hands caught him and kept him upright. What the hell, man? Karma growled, bringing his gaze back towards the suspect of his current predicament. What did you do to me? Panic seeped into his bones, and he was convinced that this was the end for him. When did he drop his guard? And how did Stain do whatever this was without him noticing? Relax, kid, Stain said calmly. Like I said, I don't plan on hurting you. I'm merely trying to help you understand. You have a funny way of showing it, Karma muttered, grinding his teeth harshly. Stain scoffed at the vigilante's quip, but didn't respond right away. A moment later he said, I'm strong, but not unbeatable. That's why I use other methods to subdue my opponents. It's easier that way. You mean whatever the hell you've done to me? Karma questioned, still feeling bitter from the blind side. Exactly, Stain confirmed as he looked at the paralyzed yet still shaking vigilante. So what you're saying is that instead of wasting energy on difficult fights, you take them out before they have a chance to beat you? Karma asked, feeling the figurative light bulbs lighting up in his brain. The paralysis was still in full effect, but he was able to lift his head, so that he was directly facing the hero killer. Seems like you understand, Stain replied, amused that the vigilante finally got his point. Now, how the hell do you get whatever you put on me to stop? Karma's relief that he finally understood was quickly replaced with agitation when he remembered that he still couldn't move his body. It'd be a while before he lived this down. He was afraid. A few more minutes, Stain assured as he continued to hold Karma up and keep him from falling off the 3-story building. A couple minutes later, Izuku was wishing farewell to the infamous hero killer and returning back to the train station after finding what he seemed to be looking for. He felt satisfied enough to retire for the night and begin his research for his upcoming upgrades. He'd probably have to talk to Hatsume, though he was unsure whether or not he could trust her to maintain confidentiality regarding possible weapons. He'd try regardless, though he'll likely try to build them on his own first. As he finally plopped himself down on the hard seats of the train, he sighed contentedly, feeling accomplished with the progress he had made thus far in his journey. Izuku didn't return home until around 2 in the morning, and by the time he entered his dimly lit apartment, he was ready to sleep for the next 10 years. Unfortunately for his aching eyes, sleep wasn't on his schedule for at least another hour or two. Izuku wanted to dedicate tomorrow to beginning the long process of creating his newest weapon, which was why he needed to finish the planning tonight. He walked down the dim hallway, slowly, hissing quietly when he felt his bones ache from the abuse they underwent that day. He really needed to take it easy. As he made his way down to the hall, he dragged his fingers along the fading wallpapers. Pictures lined the wall from a time before his mother's passing, as he couldn't bring himself to remove them from the place they had lived for years. Finally making it to his bedroom, Izuku promptly changed into much more comfortable clothing and settled into the swivel chair standing adjacent to his cluttered desk. Random knickknacks and supplies covered the expanse like a second layer, and he had to swipe away some of the tools to make room for his notebook and prepare for his impending research. First things first, how should he immobilize his opponent? Would a man-made drug work, or should he rely on something more natural? Both were viable options that came with advantages, but he'd have to use something that was easily accessible. Given that perspective, natural would probably be better. Drugs, especially those with the power to incapacitate another human, would be close to impossible to find without a black market, and he didn't want unnecessary attention drawn to himself either. It'd have to be his very own concoction, or else the police might connect his new takedowns to a known drug, therefore giving them an actual reason to arrest him. Okay, so plant-based it is, but what did he have to work with? Izuku loaded up his computer and winced as the bright screen blinded him momentarily. Mood? He was certain that if Eraser were here, he'd call him a vampire or something equally as annoying. Finding the files icon on his home screen, he clicked on it and began looking through what the police had on file. Okay, yes, all the data they had was illegally obtained. Well, all the data he had was illegally obtained, but what the police and the Eraser didn't know didn't hurt them. About half a year ago, he used the money he had been saving for years to buy good enough software that allowed him to test and hone his skill at hacking into websites and databases. His biggest haste, what he liked to call them, was undoubtedly when he hacked into UA's system to get his hands on the entrance exam footage. He had been incredibly curious about what quarks would be making their debut in the hero course, and given his recently mastered skill, he just had to put it to the test. It also came in handy at times when he needed information about criminals or the news in the underground. The police website was a cinch compared to others, but out of fear of files getting deleted, he downloaded them all to a hard drive for everlasting use. The underground website, which was typically used by underground heroes and law enforcers, was a little bit tougher, though not difficult enough to be sweat-inducing. As he looked through the various folders, each labeled with different topics, he finally stopped scrolling when he came across dangerous and invasive plants in Japan. They likely had it stored to keep track of what new plants may pop up unexpectedly, along with helping officers stay aware of what ones to look out for. Well, regardless of the reason, it made his job easier. Clicking on the file, Izuku grinned widely as he skimmed over the long page of options. There were well over 100 different plans on the document, so he looked for keywords in each description until one caught his interest. He didn't want something that would only cause a rash, but he also wasn't looking for its victims to topple over in agony. He simply needed something that would either A. temporarily paralyze his opponents, or B. knock them unconscious. After about 20 or so minutes of searching, he finally found something that appealed to him. It was a relative of the invasive plant Solanum americanum, better known as the American nightshade. The original plant was native to North and South America, but became invasive in countries in Asia, especially Japan, in recent years. The plant was actually its relative, so its effects were a bit different. Typically, its effect included things like nausea, hallucinations, and vomiting, along with incapacitating its victim. But Izuku wasn't looking for side effects as ghastly as those. Fortunately, the relative he was currently browsing only had paralysis and anesthesia as effects, and it depended on how it was used. If the leaves were ingested, temporary paralysis was the side effect, but the berries that grew on the dangerous plant were much stronger, and if they entered the bloodstream, anesthesia was all but likely. If he could manage the doses properly, it would probably work. Izuku's eyes lit up at the discovery, and he began to frantically take notes on everything he could find on the plant. If he was lucky, one could be growing in the forest a couple of kilometers from his house. Since he still had a few more days before he was due to return to school, he'd use them to begin the process of improving his artillery. He glanced at his clock and noticed that it was nearing 3:30 a.m., so he decided that he had made enough progress for the night and turned off his computer, collapsed onto the bed without another thought, and his body too exhausted to care about anything else might have had to do. He had a lot of work to complete, but that was a problem for tomorrow, Izuku. Tomorrow came a little too soon, was Izuku's thought process as he began his trek into the woods. His limbs felt worse today compared to yesterday, proving that not even Recovery Girl could heal the aches that lived deep inside Izuku's joints. He really did overwork himself yesterday, given how many one-on-one fights he had to face off in. His thought process remained the same as he trudged through the thick forest. Overgrown vines and displaced roots were scattered throughout the grassy terrain, making it more difficult than he would have liked to travel through the woods. He studied all of the different plants carefully, looking for the one he had read about the previous night. The file mentioned that the invasive plant could be found in forests near Musutafu, so he just had to get lucky in order to find it. He was hoping that with a bucket, shovel, and a little stroke of luck, he'd be able to bring it back to his home safely and create a miniature farm in the process. He continued to trek slowly, carefully looking out for any harmful plants that also resided in the same forest as the nightshade. Looking up at the sky, he saw the sun shining above. It was about 2 p.m., if he was to take a guess. Checking his watch, his guess was confirmed correct, and he wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead as he continued his venture. Thankfully, the thick tree branches protected him from what he could imagine would be the ruthless glare of the sun, so his walk wasn't as bad as it would have been if he was out on a field or something equally exposed. He wondered how the second years were doing in the sports festival. As much as Izuku wanted to attend the other 2 days of the festival, especially since he got free admission, he decided against it in order to focus on upgrading his current abilities before school obligations would take up most of his time. He'd just have to re-watch the footage another day, he supposed. About an hour of searching later, Izuku had finally found what he was looking for. He miraculously came across a popular hiking trail that many of the residents of Musutafu used, and when he scoped out the area a few meters away from the trail, he recognized the oval-shaped green leaves, delicate white flowers, and notorious purpley black berries. The plant was fortunately a good size, and by the amount of berries they carried, he was sure that he'd be able to create a glorious stock of serum. Carefully, he threw on a pair of gardening gloves and kneeled down next to the plant, admiring it silently before starting to dig around it. He'd have to dig up the roots in order to maintain the survival of the plant, so its procedure would have to be carefully done. Izuku knew a little about gardening through previous research he had done on the topic, but this extraction would really put his knowledge to the test. He dug up the soil around the plant gently, as he feared that any wrong move could result in serious damage. Finally, he was able to find the beginning of the nightshade's roots and slowly but surely pull them out of the ground. He plopped the now dug-up plant into the pail he brought with him, followed by the miniature shovel and generous amount of soil, and got back on his feet. Sighing contentedly with his find, Izuku began his walk back home, this time following the pre-made path. He figured he'd keep his eye out in case any more plants caught an eye, but he wasn't particularly worried if he didn't find another. He could work with one, considering how strong the plant already was. Walking the path back was considerably more relaxing than the hike through untamed forest. With his goal complete, he was able to embrace the beauty of nature instead of being completely focused on the task at hand. About 15 minutes later, he was nearing the exit of the trail and hummed happily, knowing that he'd soon be home. However, that quickly morphed into fear when he saw a familiar head of hair turn the corner of the path. Typically, he was excellent at sensing one's presence when they were directly focused on him, almost like he had a sensor or whatever he was being watched. But in cases like this, where people didn't know he was there to begin with, he wasn't able to use that same talent. Thankfully, he saw them before they noticed him, so maybe if he kept his head down, he could just...
Niku! What the hell are you doing here?
Kachan asked gruffly, surprise littering his previously stoic face.
I thought I was just going on a walk to clear my head about yesterday, you know?
Izuku replied, trying his hardest to sound nonchalant. This could be over quickly if he didn't act suspiciously.
Well, what about you? I for sure thought you would be at the sports festival, he added for good measure.
Kachan eyed him apprehensively, as if he didn't fully believe him, but scoffed nonetheless.
Not that it's any of your damn business, nerd, but I hike these trails all the time.
Huh, Izuku hummed, not fully surprised by the blonde's answer. He did know that Kachan was a fan of hiking. He had been since they were little, but he had no idea that this was his preferred trail. He'd have to remember that for the next time.
Speaking of the sports festival,
Kachan said, knocking Izuku out of his inner monologue,
I've been meaning to ask you about something, and you better not lie to me.
His tone was serious, and even Izuku, who had dealt with all of Kachan's moods, knew not to intentionally push any buttons if he spoke like that.
What is it?
Izuku asked nervously, his voice cracking slightly. This conversation could go a multitude of ways, and he was worried about which route it would take. He really needed to pull his shit together. It was only Kacchan, for God's sake.
How in the living hell did you manage to pull off all this shit at the festival? And don't say it was just luck, because we both know that's not what's going on here. Last year, you could barely bench press during gym, but somehow you held your own against half and half. You're hiding something, and I want to know what it is.
As Kacchan's little spiel continued, his voice became quickly more frustrated, as if the very idea of their current situation pissed him off exponentially. The worst part? Kacchan did have a point. Last year he purposely didn't lift much to keep a low profile, so to Kacchan it probably looked like he gained superpowers overnight. How was he supposed to explain this in a way that wouldn't cause the least amount of agitation? Finally, his mind settled on something. Shinso had been wanting to train before the sports festival. Izuku began hesitantly, unsure if this answer would suffice in Kacchan's eyes. Before our third year, I decided to learn basic fighting techniques, as well as train to become stronger. So that mixed with the extra training with Shinso, I was able to do alright in this festival, he explained, trying to hide the nervousness he felt. Kacchan continued to glare at him, though the rest of his features remained neutral, making it difficult for Izuku to read how he was feeling. Izuku's hand fidgeted as he waited for an answer, and his eyes made contact with just about anything other than the blonde's intense gaze. Time felt like it had frozen as he stood anxiously, not knowing what to do with himself.
So you're trying to get into the hero course? That's what it is?
Kacchan asked angrily as he proceeded to push himself into Izuku's space. A common intimidation tactic. For being as smart as he was, Kacchan couldn't understand him to save his life.
What? No, Kacchan, that wasn't my intention,
Izuku replied, quickly throwing his hands in front of him to deter Kacchan from moving any closer.
Then what was it, huh?
He questioned further, his voice still laced with agitation, though he didn't push through the weak barrier Izuku had set up.
I only wanted Shinso to win, that's all. I thought that if I helped him score high, then he'd be allowed into the hero course. This has nothing to do with me, I swear.
Izuku explained, feeling desperate. Kacchan wasn't understanding his intentions, and all he wanted was to defuse whatever this was before it got out of hand. Izuku's anxiety spiked when Kacchan didn't respond right away. His posture was still and unwavering, and his brows narrowed in confusion. Izuku's anxiety was soon replaced with frustration when he realized that the blonde wasn't paying attention to him.
Are you even listening to me? Hello? Kacchan?
Izuku asked, waving his hand in front of Kacchan's face. As he looked down to see what the blonde was focusing on, he felt his heart drop to his stomach.
What the hell is that?
Kacchan asked, his voice hushed as he pointed towards the tin bucket in Izuku's grasp that held the distinct plant.
It's just a plant I found and thought it was cool, figured I'd take it home.
Izuku said, voice wobbling as he began to turn away and make a break for it down the street. There was no way he'd get out of this without exposing the truth, so it was better to just evade and leave at all costs before it slipped out.
Deku, what the hell were you really doing in the woods?
Kacchan questions, gripping Izuku's wrist tightly. His tone as dangerous as Izuku had ever heard it.
Abort!
In your own words, Kacchan, Izuku replied, his voice sounding surprisingly even. But it's none of your damn business. And with that, he freed himself from the blonde's grip and sprinted towards the city, leaving a very confused and skeptical Kacchan standing motionless on the path.
Damn boy,
Izuku didn't stop to breathe until he got back to the safety of his apartment. That run-in was way too close for comfort, and it was honestly a miracle that Kachan didn't chase after him like Izuku was expecting him to. The bigger miracle for him, however, was that he said all that to Kachan and survived. If he thought he was dead at the sports festival, then he doesn't even know what he is now. Shaking the thought from his head, he focused his gaze on the bucket in his hand. The plant still looked in relatively good shape, but he needed to get it back into the soil as soon as possible. Grabbing an empty pot that was collecting dust, both literally and figuratively, on his balcony, Izuku dragged it towards the middle of the terrace and plopped the tin pail next to it. He threw on his gardening gloves once again and gently placed the nightshade into the pot. He then filled the pot with the soil he had collected in the forest and patted it gently into its new home. Lastly, Izuku went to the kitchen to grab water and a container, and then returned to his spot next to the plant. Once the plant was watered, Izuku carefully extracted the berries, along with a few leaves, from the nightshade and placed them into the container he had laid to the right of him. If Izuku was being honest, he wasn't too experienced in the art of concoction making, but really, how hard could it be? Taking a seat at his desk, his eyes scanned over the various objects he had to work with. The container carrying the nightshade's leaves and berries, a wooden bowl and masher, his notebook, a cloth, and of course his favorite knife. He wasn't sure how much of the toxin he would need for a simple takedown, and there was only one way to find out. He wasn't really looking forward to it. Sighing, Izuku uses the bowl and masher to grind the oval leaves into smaller chunks. Next, he added water along with a few other ingredients to create something that at least looked like some sort of chemical. As long as it's effective, the appearance doesn't really matter. Izuku hummed as he lifted the bowl into the air to observe the newly created substance more closely. With his first serum hopefully being a success, Izuku pulled out his phone to set a timer while using his other hand to reach for the knife that was sitting on his desk. Izuku gulped as he brought the knife to eye level before gently dipping it in the green liquid that he was sure would do nothing but be a hindrance to him for the next few hours. Given that he was alone and heavily against experimentation on others, he really didn't have much of a choice besides taking the first hit himself and hoping for the best. Taking one final breath, Izuku started the timer and used the knife to lightly cut into the inside of his arm, so that the toxin could enter his bloodstream. Not only did he want to see how long his concoction would last, but he also needed to know how quickly its effect would appear. It would be no good to use a sedative in a fight if it took 2 or more minutes to kick in, which is why he didn't have much of a choice in terms of testing out its limits. It wasn't even 30 seconds before Izuku felt a chilling rush run through his body, followed by the memorable sensation of his joints being twisted into knots. He gritted his teeth as he felt his body become overtaken by a state of paralysis, while also struggling to maintain balance on his swivel chair. At least it kicked in quickly, he thought to himself, trying to find a silver lining in his currently uncomfortable situation. Deciding not to waste any time, Izuku attempted to wiggle his fingers through, though he was incredibly unsuccessful. Regardless of his persistent attempts, next he tried moving his head, which was more fruitful than his previous attempts. By the time the paralysis ended, which was 47 minutes and 23 seconds exactly, Izuku determined quite a few things about his first drug. he gets extremely bored incredibly quickly. He couldn't move anything that was below his neck. His neck and head he could move slightly, and he could fully move his eyes and other facial features. The slightest cut lasted 47 minutes, so it was reasonable to guess that the more that entered the bloodstream, the longer the paralysis would last. He was still able to talk, meaning that if need be, he could still interact with criminals. Contrary to what he expected, the paralysis didn't go away all at once. Instead, he slowly felt tingling wash through his body, starting at his fingertips and continuing inwards until his entire body felt weird. When he felt completely recovered from the first substance, he proceeded with the second. He repeated the process as the leaves with the berries, though he was more conservative with adding anything extra considering the much more liquid state of the berries. The serum was a stunning shade of dark purple, which led to him naming it Twilight's Eclipse. After his decision to name it, he realized that Hatsume was rubbing off on him a little too much. He cleaned off his knife that was covered in the previous toxin, which he had dubbed Viridian Lock, and began to try his luck with the second substance of the day. The minute it entered his bloodstream, he kept close eye on his stopwatch, determined to see how long it would take for him to kick in. As he watched the numbers attentively, he felt his eyes begin to droop, and it wasn't long until his eyes refused to open and he felt his consciousness slip away. It wasn't until about an hour and a half later that Izuku's eyes opened and he remembered where he was and what he was doing. When the realization hit him, he sprung up from his bed, which he had chosen to sit prior to the second experiment, and checked the ongoing stopwatch that was still laying on his pillow. He sighed, full of relief, as he stopped the timer and made his way back over to his desk. Well, at least he didn't die. Stretching his fingers, he wrote down his conclusions about the second experience with this drug. 1. It takes about a minute to kick in, though it could be faster depending on how fast one's blood is pumping. It lasts around 1.5 hours, though it could be longer if more is consumed. Izuku hummed happily, feeling incredibly proud of his progress, and closed his notebook. He headed towards the kitchen, suddenly feeling famished, though that was likely due to the stress his body had undergone today. For dinner, he decided that a cup of ramen would suffice and began to work through the rest of his agenda for the day as he waited for the water to boil. He'd need to look around for new knife sheaths, preferably ones that could hold his perilous substance without breaking or leaking during the fight. Then he'd have to make costume adjustments to accommodate the newest additions of his artillery. Although he always had knives on hand, during patrols they were often hidden because he didn't typically need them. Given their strength, these new weapons should have a better spot, especially if he needed them for quick access. Lastly, he still had his patrol with a razor tonight, and it's not like he could just skip it. He glanced at the clock and noticed that it was nearing 7 p.m., which meant he had a few hours before his patrol began. Well, he might as well just get started. Well, wasn't that a doozy? And for the first time, I think I have a blooper. So enjoy. Well, you're brave, kid. Most people run up. Så att du bekymrar.